We have talked about the synoptic gospels and the Gospel of John. Especially yesterday, we spoke about the Gospel of John while we're thinking of Jesus. Now, what we also should remember when we come to the teachings of Jesus is that Jesus himself had no scripture. That is to say, he had no gospels, and he was Jewish. Therefore, he did have the Old Testament as it was in his time, which he knew very well. And you can tell this because many, many times you will find in the Gospels and the Gospel of John that he is quoting the Old Testament scriptures exactly, especially when he's questioned by people and he's answering questions. Now, and of course, Jesus didn't write. He never wrote anything down. The only time he did write, he drew pictures in the sand when a woman was caught in adultery and others came to tell Jesus that she had to be stoned to death. Now, Jesus knelt down and wrote in the sand twice during that time. No one knows what he wrote. No one knows why he wrote. Were they actual words for the woman, or were they some kind of signs? No one knows. There are all kinds of opinions on that. But that's the only time that we know of that Jesus ever wrote anything. Obviously, he didn't write the Gospels. They were written after Jesus, not before. Although the Gospels were written by some who were witnesses of Jesus. So you get very close to Jesus that way. But one thing also very interesting about the Old Testament as something that Jesus knew very well, because on the road to Emmaus, when Jesus came back to the disciples, and they didn't know who he was, they didn't recognize him, they didn't recognize anything about him, and Jesus was asking them what's going on here. He said, they've taken our master away. They've taken him away. We don't know where he is or what happened to him. Well, then what happened at that point, Jesus began quoting all the Old Testament about himself and how these things in the Old Testament were prophecies about himself. So this was a very interesting way that we understand the teachings of Jesus, who absorbed within himself the Old Testament that he had at the time so well that he didn't need to have it and read it. He just quoted it from memory, and it opened the eyes of these disciples to realize that he wasn't dead or gone completely as they expected, but that he was a spiritual being that had the capacity to come down and be recognized physically. So Jesus was a teacher of spiritual dimensions as well as earthly dimensions. He also was Jewish, and therefore his main message was, first of all, to the Jewish people. This was what he was up to. And we will see eventually, though, that the Jewish people, enough of them did not accept him. Now, some did, obviously, but enough of them did not accept him so that he was not allowed to continue his teaching up to a certain point, because he was becoming too popular among the Jewish people. He was becoming too popular among the Roman emperor who ruled that era and ruled those Jews, and was causing enough trouble to make them think that something had to be done with him. And this idea of doing something to him was based on much of his teaching. He taught things that were not acceptable, not only to the Jewish tradition as it was, but it was not even acceptable to the regular people who know their all of their traditions and so forth. This is very important to remember, his Jewish lineage, and that he was there to serve the Jewish people first.